Hey everybody, welcome to the start of Chapter 5. Chapter 5.1 is going to be talking about the congruence and different triangles. Triangles and congruence. We are going to be learning about how to identify congruent triangles and how to identify congruent parts based on those triangles. Okay, so please write this down. I know it seems like a lot, but it is important information. It says, geometric figures are congruent if they are the same size and shape. Corresponding angles and corresponding sides are in the same position in polygons with an equal number of sides. Two polygons are congruent polygons if and only if their corresponding sides are congruent. Thus, triangles that are the same size and shape are congruent. That is important. Same size and shape are congruent. So we're going to be talking about corresponding sides, corresponding angles, the congruency between them, the congruency between the triangles. It is going to be a great lesson. Please write this down. This is the properties of congruent polygons, both triangles and other polygons as well. Okay, so please draw the diagram, include your corresponding angles, and include your corresponding sides that go along with it. And I will explain in just a moment. All right, so looking at this, I do want you to notice this statement right here, where it says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. That's very important because the order of their letters bases your congruent angles and your congruent sides, the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides. If you notice that A and D are in that first position on that congruent statement, because they are in the first position, they are congruent to each other. So because it says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, angle A and angle D are congruent because they are in the first position. Second position, B and E, because those two are in the second letter in that statement of each corresponding triangle, they are congruent as well. Angle B is congruent to angle E. Lastly, angle C and F, those are also congruent because they are in the third position of that congruent statement. Same thing, if you look at AB, okay, I'm going to erase this. Looking at sides, AB are the first two letters, which means the first two letters of DEF are DE. That tells me that those are congruent. BC is congruent to EF because those are the second two letters. Same thing with AC and DF. Those are also congruent. So it all depends on where the letters are in correlation to the congruent statement. That's very important. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. It says when you write a statement such as triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, you are also stating which parts are congruent. That's what we just stated in the previous slide. So, in other words, here's the given statement. It gives us triangle PQR is congruent to triangle STW. We're going to identify all the parts of the corresponding congruent parts. So, based on that information, that statement right there, that congruent statement, I can tell you the exact angles that are congruent and the exact sides that are congruent. So based on that, I can tell you angle P is going to be congruent to angle S because they are in the same position. Same thing with Q and T. Angle Q will be congruent to angle T. Last but not least, angle R is congruent to angle W because they are in the same corresponding spot as the congruent statement. Okay, same thing with our sides. All right, we're looking at PQ, which is the first two letters of that triangle of PQR, which means ST is going to be congruent to that. QR is congruent to TW. They're congruent as well. Last but not least, we have our last one, which is PR is congruent to SW. Okay, so their positions in the congruent statements tells me what parts are congruent to each other, what angles are congruent to each other, and what sides are congruent to each other. So I want you to give this one a shot. It gives you the congruent statement, and I want you to identify all the corresponding parts and all the corresponding, which means corresponding sides and angles. Please write this down. Pause now. Give this one a shot. All right, so we'll see what you came up with. Your answer should look something like this. Angle L is going to be congruent to angle E. Angle M is congruent to angle F. Angle N is congruent to angle G. Again, based on their position in this congruent statement. All right? Now we also have our angles here. Now we are going to find our sides. Based on their position, I can say side LM is congruent to side EF. Next one, side MN is congruent to side FG. Last but not least, we have side LN is congruent to side EG. Okay, so their position in that that congruent statement tells me which ones are congruent, which parts are congruent. Awesome. So looking at these two triangles right here, it tells me the two triangles are congruent. They are congruent, and it gives you that information. We are going to identify all the corresponding congruent parts, and then you are going to write a congruent statement. And when you write a congruent statement, that is going to be triangle whatever is congruent to triangle whatever. Okay? So you're going to write one triangle is congruent to the other triangle for your congruence statement. I want you to give this one a shot. Pause now. Try it. All right. So looking at this, first we're going to identify all the corresponding parts, corresponding congruent parts, and I'm going to start with my sides because it does give me my little tick marks. It does tell me which side is congruent to which side. Okay, so looking at this, I know that according to this information, side YX is going to be congruent to side LM. Then side XZ is congruent to side MN. And side YZ is congruent to side LN. Okay? That is my congruent sides. Now, we're looking for our angles. Which angle is congruent to which angle? Okay, so we can tell definitely, starting off with our angles, that our 90-degree angles are also congruent. Always congruent. 90 is congruent to 90. So angle X is congruent to angle M. We also know that 61 degrees is also congruent to 61 degrees. So angle Y is congruent to angle L. Okay. Last but not least, we have our final final angle. Well, if we know that the other two angles of this triangle are congruent, we can safely say that that third side is going to be congruent because of the postulates that we know, that angle sum theorem. Okay? We know that if If you added 90 and 61 together, it would be equal to the other side of 90 and 60. Subtract from 180, they would all be the same. So angle Z is going to be congruent to angle N. Okay, so we found our corresponding parts. We are done with those corresponding congruent parts. Now comes the congruent statement, and we have to be careful with our congruent statement because you need to make sure that it is in the correct order that allows us to have our angles congruent and allows us to have our sides congruent. It needs to be the correct order because we can't just put we can't just put angles in there and make it congruent to other angles. So our congruent statement would be, you can have one statement could be triangle y, x, z is congruent to triangle L, M, N. Okay, right off the bat, I'm going to check to see if this is true. And if you look at angle Y would be congruent to angle L. Okay, that would be right there on our angle statement. We know that angle X is congruent to angle M. Check. Angle Z would be congruent to angle N. Check. Then check your sides as well. YX would be congruent to LM. They are in the same order. Yes, XZ would be congruent to MN. Absolutely. And finally, YZ is congruent to LN. Yep, that works all together. We can have that statement. The other two statements that would also be true, because there's going to be three congruent statements that you can have. You can also do triangle X, Z, Y would be congruent to triangle M, N, L. X is congruent to M, Z is congruent to N, Y is congruent to L. Okay, and then your triangles, XZ and MN, yep, and all your sides would also work. The other one that would work would be triangle ZYX is congruent to triangle NLM. Okay, those are the three statements that you can put down. If you have any questions about this, remember, please ask me. Just make sure that that last congruent statement, you can have the first one, second one, or the third one. Hopefully you have one of those three. Awesome. The last problem of the day, it gives us the information of triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Okay, and we are finding the value of X. So based on that congruence statement, you should be able to find X. I want you to try to see if you can find what X is. All right, give this one a shot. All right, so we know the only statement with the X in there is going to be segment AB. Okay, we need to set up a formula to solve this. Okay, so we're looking at AB. First two letters of the congruent statement in ABC, so we know that it will be congruent to DE, which is this segment. Always look back at your congruence statement to see which sides are congruent, which angles are congruent. So we know that side AB is congruent to side DE based on this congruence statement. All right, so then what is AB? AB is 2x minus 2. What is DE? DE is 6. We know that they are congruent, which means they are the exact same measure. So we now have our algebraic equation. Let's solve it algebraically. Add 2 to each side. We get 2x is equal to 8. Divide by 2 on each side. X is equal to 4. Awesome. We just solved for X by setting up an algebraic equation. That's what your first step should be, is setting up an equation. Make sure you know what the congruent statement states about your corresponding parts or your corresponding sides or your corresponding angles. Make sure you know that. Okay, if you have any questions, again, please ask me when you see me. I hope you enjoy your night or your day. Have a good day.